Hey everyone, welcome to the vlog. Today I'm going to do another rock and roll history video, which is always my favorite thing to do. When I started this vlog, this was something I was really excited to do, was these little rock and roll history lesson videos. Today I'm going to talk about the Temptations. I think I'm going to do this as a bit of a series covering Motown groups. I wanted to start with the Temptations because their past is such a web. It took me years of research since I was a teenager to piece together their whole history. They have a very complicated 57-year past, which includes dozens of members, lineup changes galore. And the moral of this video, the thing that I really want to teach you, is the fact that the Temptations are cursed. I am convinced of this. Someone up there doesn't want the Temptations to be around. They've had a lot of unfortunate circumstances happen, especially in the last 20 or 30 years. You're going to see what I mean as I get into this video. And this is going to be a long video because it's a very complicated history. So the Temptations can be traced back to the late 50s in two competing kind of doo-wop groups out of Detroit, or still in Detroit. They weren't touring around. They were just in Detroit. There were a few bands, like this one had this street corner and this one had this street corner, and then this band would get gigs in this part of town, and there was a lot of competition, and it led to eventually the creation of Motown Records and all that, which didn't exist until 1959. But two of these competing groups out of Detroit were there was the Primes, and then there was also the Distants. That's Distants, the Distants. It was Otis Williams and the Distants. So Otis Williams was a member of that group, as was Richard Street and Melvin Franklin. Let me know in the comments if I'm messing any of this up. I want to say Al Bryant was in that group as well. And the Primes were Eddie Kendricks. Al Bryant was in the Primes. Eddie Kendricks and Al Bryant were in that group, as well as Paul Williams. And the Primes had kind of a sister group, if you will, called the Primettes. And the Primettes would go on to become the Supremes, but that's a whole other video. In 1961, both of those groups disband and kind of merged together to create almost like a Detroit supergroup. And they call themselves the Temptations. The original lineup of the Temptations was lead singer Al Bryant. Or actually, I guess the guy who sang lead most in the early days would have been Paul Williams. But he was kind of, over the years, relegated to second baritone. But yeah, so you had Al Bryant, Paul Williams, bass singer Melvin Franklin, a third baritone, Otis Williams, and of course the up-high tenor singer, Eddie Kendricks. So that was the original lineup, and they were around for 3 years. They did some recordings. They signed to Motown fairly early and were a part of the touring Motown show in 1962 and 1963. They used to do a touring from town to town. You'd have 8 or 9 Motown acts on a bill. And the Temptations were always a part of that, but they didn't have any hits yet. Fast forward to around Christmas time, 1963, Al Bryant, the lead singer at the time, gets into an altercation with one of the higher-ups at Motown, like a literal physical altercation at the company Christmas party, and he gets immediately fired from the Temptations. His replacement is a guy by the name of David Ruffin, and when David Ruffin enters the group in January of 1964, that's what's considered to Temptations fans as the Classic Five lineup. So David Ruffin's first recording session as a member of the Temptations is for the song The Way You Do the Things You Do. The lead singer for that song was tenor singer Eddie Kendricks, and that song became their first charting top 40 song. And it was a big deal for them. They would watch it every week, climb up and up the charts, and they couldn't believe they suddenly had their breakout single. And so for a while, they made Eddie Kendricks sort of sing lead a lot in 1964. And until in December of 1964, they had David Ruffin sing lead on a song called My Girl. All these early records, by the way, were written and produced by Smokey Robinson, the great Smokey Robinson. So My Girl becomes their first number one hit and becomes the spring smash breakout song for 1965. And just projects the Temptations into enormous fame, and which they would maintain for a few years. They had a number of singles around that time, but I'm not going to really get into their chart history so much because I just want to talk about all their lineup changes and breakups and weird stuff. So the Classic 5 lineup only existed for 4 years, between 64 and 68, which was the original tenure of David Ruffin in that group. In 1968, David Ruffin was kind of getting really full of himself by all accounts, and he demanded like a separate limousine, and he was trying to push for the Temptations to change their name to David Ruffin and the Temptations. Bear in mind, this was at a time that the Supremes had become Diana Ross and the Supremes, the Miracles had become Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, and he was like, I'm the lead singer of this band, it should be David Ruffin and the Temptations, which would never have worked because the whole point of the Temptations is different members sing lead at different times. You have your Eddie Kendrick songs, you have your David Ruffin songs, you have your Paul Williams songs, you know? They all sing. So that didn't make a whole lot of sense, but he was, like I said, getting a little full of himself, and eventually he was fired in 1968 from the group and replaced by Dennis Edwards, who you would think Temptations pretty much at the peak of their popularity in 1968, having a change of lead singer would just make them plummet, but no, they actually had a lot of success in the Dennis Edwards era. Apparently, shortly after he was fired, David Ruffin would come to Temptations gigs just in the audience and then walk up on stage and take the mic from Dennis Edwards, and the crowd would scream, but the Temptations were like, you can't, we fired you? You kind of can't keep coming to our shows and like doing that anymore. So that only lasted a few months before he quit doing that, and then he wound up having a fairly successful solo career of his own. And then, Dennis Edwards becomes the new lead singer of the group, and they have a ton of success with stuff like Cloud 9, and then they enter their weird psychedelic period around then as well. In 1969, they have an enormous hit with the song Can't Get Next to You. So Can't Get Next to You becomes their group's second number one single, but it's around this time that the Temptations become cursed, as far as I'm concerned. In 1969, Paul Williams develops sickle cell anemia and is forced to start missing performances occasionally due to his illness. Now, to fill his role in the group, they bring in Richard Street occasionally when he needs to sub in, starting in late 1969 and going on until 71. He was an original member of Otis Williams and The Distance, and so had been kind of involved with the Temptations' history for like 10 years already. But for all promotional appearances and for the majority of concerts, Paul Williams was still hanging in there, still a member of the group. In late 1970, some things start to go weird when tenor-singer Eddie Kendricks quits the group. They had some big fight, and he left. I think they were at the Copacabana at the time. In November of 1970, they were in the middle of like a week-long engagement. He just said, I'm out. He left. And then they kind of panicked because they were like, that's not good. He's like quite possibly their most famous member who was in the group at that time. And so they actually eventually convinced him to rejoin the group. And in January of 1971, he sang lead on the single Just My Imagination, Running Away With Me, which became their third ever number one hit. But he quit for good right after that came out. So in the Temptations' history, he's hardly ever gotten a chance to sing it live with the Temptations because he quit so soon after the song's release. And so he was replaced. This is one of the few times I have to actually check my notes. I have most of this in memory, but it gets too complicated for me to remember it all. Ricky Owens replaces him in 1971 and only lasts a few weeks. He starts to forget lyrics, and so Otis Williams, who has already become kind of the de facto leader of the Temptations by this point, gets fed up with it and kicks him out pretty quick. and then he's replaced by Damon Harris as a permanent new tenor singer, and he stays for a while, and they finally have a tenor singer they're happy with. And also later in 1971, Paul Williams quits the Temptations for good due to the sickle cell anemia. He just couldn't continue performing. He was replaced full-time by Richard Street now. Richard Street, who had been filling in for him occasionally, becomes a full-time Temptation. So now you only have 2 of the Classic 5 Temptations. Even by 1971, there were 2 Classic 5 Temptations members still touring. Those were Otis Williams, the third baritone, and the bass singer Melvin Franklin. You would think that the Temptations would completely falter with that no one would care about them anymore now that most of their classic lineup is gone. Bear in mind, they still have Dennis Edwards, who has a bunch of hits under his belt by this point. But they kind of shock everyone, and in 1972, they put out Papa Was a Rolling Stone, which Dennis Edwards sings lead on, and it becomes an enormous hit, another #1, probably their second most famous song of all time, and behind My Girl, of course, and totally rejuvenates the Temptations, and but only for a time, because after that the hits sort of dry up for the Temptations pretty quickly after that, but they continue to tour for many years. In 1973, though, now former member of the Temptations, Paul Williams, launches a solo career, releases 1 or 2 singles, and then passes away unexpectedly. The coroner's report says that it's a self-inflicted gunshot wound. There are theorists that say otherwise. I'm totally not going to get into that, but unfortunately he passes away in 1973. And then 2 years later, the original lead singer of the Temptations, Al Bryant, who was the guy who got fired after the Christmas party in '63 I was talking about, he passes away in 1975. So technically after 1975, there's only 3 original Temptations left alive. In 1975, the Papa Was a Rolling Stone lineup of the Temptations ends when Damon Harris is fired by Otis Williams for, I guess, apparently he said something in some magazine art interview that made the Temptations look bad. I don't have any clue what the quote actually is, but either way, he was fired and replaced by Glenn Leonard as the new tenor singer. That only lasts like a year and a half. In 1976, the Temptations put out an album called Wings of Love that pretty much exclusively features Dennis Edwards as the singer for all the songs. Like I said earlier, the Temptations were one of those bands that split lead singing duties among the members, but apparently Dennis Edwards, now they accuse Dennis Edwards of getting too full of himself and colluding with the producer to make sure he's the only one singing lead, and there's a whole nother fight, and they throw out Dennis Edwards at the end of 1976, which proves to be a huge mistake, because when they bring in Louis Price as his replacement member, the audiences really diminish, and interest in the Temptations' new recordings falls to an all-time low. And because Dennis Edwards was probably the most recognizable member of the group that was still involved with the lineup at that point. With him out, it started to fall apart. So that only lasted 3 years. In 1980, they brought back Dennis Edwards, probably in a bit of a desperate plea to get some fans back. And it doesn't really work. They have an album called Power that doesn't do particularly well. And in 1982, they do something drastic. They actually do a full-blown reunion. They rehire the other 2 Classic 5 members, being David Ruffin, of course, of My Girl fame, and Eddie Kendricks, who did Just My Imagination and Get Ready and all those songs. So they're back in the lineup. So now you got 4 of the Classic 5 Temptations in the lineup, and they didn't replace anyone either. For a while in 1982, there were 7 Temptations in the reunion era. And there really needed to be, because the 2, David Ruffin and Eddie Kendricks, who had been brought back in, were not reliable at this point by any means. David Ruffin had drug problems, and he was not showing up to some shows occasionally. and Eddie Kendricks' voice had been really damaged from years of chain smoking at this point. And just all in all, the reunion never worked out. An album came out that was fairly successful, which had a song called Standing at the Top, which featured Rick James, and was a minor radio hit for them. And they did about a 2-month tour before they fired Dennis, and I keep calling him Dennis, David Ruffin and Eddie Kendricks. They got fired fairly shortly after they were rehired. The reunion wound up being a very brief thing, and they went back to business as usual with the same lineup that had existed before that. In 1983, Motown is in the middle of a bit of a revival, and they do a Motown 25 special. A lot of Motown groups reunited for that, but the Temptations had just had the whole falling out the year before, so they weren't about to attempt that. But for Motown 25, they unveiled another new lineup, because by this point they had fired tenor singer of 8 years, Damon Harris, and they replaced him with Ron Tyson, who's actually still a member of the Temptations to this day. Spoiler alert. And he becomes a new tenor singer, and that's the lineup that's on Motown 25. And they also recorded a live long-form video on their 1983 tour, which is pretty cool to see that lineup. At the beginning of 1984, Dennis Edwards, again, like I said, perhaps the most recognizable member of the group at that point, who had already been fired that one time when Louis Price came in and it didn't work out for them. By early 84, they were annoyed with him again, so they fired him, and they brought in a new lead singer named Ali Ollie Woodson, who actually quickly became a fan favorite. Temptations fans actually liked him. Again, this also coincided, like I said, with Motown and the music of Motown having quite a resurgence. So the Temptations were in demand for bookings again. And in 84, they had a minor hit with the song Treat Her Like a Lady, and another one in 1986 with Lady Soul. So quickly, fans started to like Ali Ollie Woodson. I'm going to take a pause there and switch over to, in 1985, Hall & Oates actually hired David Ruffin and Eddie Kendricks as the original leads of the Temptations, they called them, to be kind of guests on the Hall & Oates tour, and they even released a live album which included those two Temptations stars, and that led to them starting a career of their own and doing their own sort of Temptations review groups, of which there have been several over the years. And Ruffin and Kendricks released an album of their own in 1987. At some point around here, Eddie Kendricks drops the S off his last name and starts touring as Eddie Kendrick. I'm not sure exactly when that was. In the meantime, the Temptations, who seemed to never be comfortable with having the same lineup for more than a couple of years, in 1987, they fire Ali Ollie Woodson, the new lead singer, and replace him with the old lead singer again, Dennis Edwards, who enters his third tenure with the group, which is by far his shortest. It doesn't even last a year, and he's ousted by mid-1988. And they just bring Ali Ollie Woodson right back. It's very complicated, but that's what happened. Meanwhile, they're getting some pressure from Ruffin and Kendricks, as in they're stealing a lot of their audience, because a lot of people, by this point, the Temptations are pretty much a nostalgia act. They're not doing new recordings that are selling really all that well. So it's kind of a battle for an audience between the official Temptations and the Ruffin Kendricks touring group. Much like what you see with the Beach Boys now, because the Beach Boys have the Beach Boys, and then they have the Brian Wilson touring band, but that's a whole other story. In 1989, the Temptations are inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And at the induction ceremony, you had Otis Williams, Melvin Franklin, who at the time were still in the Temptations, David Ruffin and Eddie Kendricks, who were touring as the separate act, and then you had Dennis Edwards inducted in as well. So all five of them had to awkwardly share a stage together, even though they all didn't really like each other much at that time. But that led to Dennis Edwards getting into talks with Ruffin and Kendricks, and he joined their former leads of the Temptations group. So now that group has three of the classic lead singers of the Temptations that audiences love and remember. And the Temptations, while they have Otis Williams and Melvin Franklin, neither of them were ever really lead singers, so now the lead singers of the Temptations are digging into the Temptations audience even more, but it's short-lived. In, I believe, June of 1991, David Ruffin dies of a cocaine overdose. And Eddie Kendrick and Dennis Edwards keep touring after that as a duo for a very brief time, because then Eddie Kendricks dies in November of 1992. Now the Temptations are really cursed, by the way. This is where the curse really sets in for them. November of 1992, Eddie Kendricks dies from lung cancer. Again, decades of chain smoking. And so that's the disintegration of that group. Dennis Edwards, I believe, takes a couple of years off before in the mid-90s forming Dennis Edwards Temptations, what's it called? The Dennis Edwards Temptations Review, which again becomes successful and becomes kind of a group that battles against the Temptations. Meanwhile, on the Temptations side of things, 22-year Temptations veteran Richard Street quits in 1993 after having an argument with Otis Williams. He's the guy who was originally in Otis Williams and the Distance back in the 50s, so his long association with the Temptations finally ends in 1993 when he quits the band, and then he forms his own review group. There become a lot of Temptations review groups in the 90s and 2000s. He is replaced by Theo Peoples in 1993. So by this point, you've got Ollie Woodson still as the lead singer. You've got Theo Peoples in what is essentially the Paul Williams spot. Melvin Franklin is still touring. Otis Williams is still touring. And, of course, Ron Tyson in the tenor spot. And that's a very short-lived lineup, too, because in 1993, Melvin Franklin starts to have health problems and complications from his diabetes, and so he starts to miss performances, and his temporary replacement to fill in for him is Ray Davis, who was formerly a bass singer for Parliament Funkadelic, actually, and they hire him on and off. So sometimes you would get Melvin, the original bass singer, when he was healthy enough, and other times he wouldn't be around in the group. But he did continue to tour on and off until the fall of 1994. In February of 1995, Melvin Franklin has a seizure and then goes into a coma for a couple weeks and eventually passes away, leaving Otis Williams as the only surviving original member of the Temptations, and the curse continues. The curse really ramps up. You'd think it couldn't. It already just took 3 of the classic 5 Temptations in the last 3 years, and then somehow the curse ramps up even more. Ray Davis, who had been hired as the temporary replacement for Melvin Franklin, gets cancer later that same year and is forced to quit the band. He had cancer on and off for several years, and he eventually passed away too. Briefly in 1995, the Temptations toured as a foursome with no bass singer, but eventually they replaced him with Harry McGilvery as the new full-time bass singer. Then at the end of 1996, popular fan favorite lead singer on and off since '84, Ollie Woodson, develops cancer as well and is forced to step down. When that happens, they promote Theo Peoples, who is in the Paul Williams spot, up to the lead singer role, and in his place, they hire a guy named Terry Weeks. And that becomes the lineup that plays at the Super Bowl halftime show. In 1998, the Super Bowl halftime show had a Motown special. They just had a bunch of Motown groups one year, and it was really cool, and that was the Temptations lineup that wound up doing that. But that was, again, short-lived. In 1998, because of a drug problem, Theo Peoples is fired from the Temptations. Side story, Theo Peoples, pretty quickly after that, actually gets hired by the Four Tops. But that's another story. His replacement as lead singer of the Temptations is Bo Henderson. That's another guy I had to check my thing, because there's been so many Temptations singers that I forget who's who sometimes. Bo Henderson joins in 1998, so now it's Bo Henderson is the lead singer. Second baritone is Terry Weeks. Third baritone, still Otis Williams, the last original member left in the Temptations. Bass singer is Harry McGilvery, and the tenor singer is Ron Tyson. So much change goes on in their history. And like I said, throughout the 90s and 2000s, Dennis Edwards is still touring with his Temptations Review. So there's kind of two groups. That lineup for the Temptations lasts 5 years, which is really long for the Temptations, unfortunately. In 2003, they really changed things up. Harry McGilvery is fired, I think, for a drug problem. And they bring in Joe Herndon as the new bass singer. And then also that same year, Bo Henderson is fired, or maybe quits, I don't even know, after 5 years of being the Temptations lead singer, and is replaced by G.C. Cameron, who was the Spinners lead singer back in the 70s. I feel like the Temptations made a concerted effort to make their group a little bit older even at that point, because the Temptations are one of those groups that whenever they have a new member, they usually hire a young guy, like in their 20s or 30s. But I've always thought that was weird, because then you have a lineup where you can clearly tell that there's like a couple of original members and then a bunch of guys in their 20s. It's weird. But Joe Herndon and G.C. Cameron were both a little bit older, and I wonder if that was a concerted effort or not. Also, one thing I forgot to mention is that in 2002, Bo Henderson couldn't get like a touring visa or something. I don't know what happened, but he was replaced for a few dates by their old singer, Ali Woodson, who had now recovered from his cancer. But that was brief. That was just a temporary thing. So the Joe Herndon and G.C. Cameron lineup of the Temptations lasts for 4 years. By the way, in 2006, Ali Woodson then goes on to join Dennis Edwards' Temptations Review. So now they have two classic Temptations singers in the Temptations Review. But in the Temptations, in 2007, G.C. Cameron quits after 4 years being the Temptations lead singer, and he's replaced by Bruce Williamson, who I think was a great lead singer for them. So in 2008, after 2 years being in the Temptations Review, Ali Woodson is forced to step down due to cancer, and then the Temptations curse keeps going, because in 2010, Ali Woodson, who had been a Temptations lead singer from 84 to 96, passed away from his cancer, unfortunately. Also in 2010, the Temptations release an album called Still Here, which was their last album for 8 years. At this point, it seems like the Temptations' strategy was to release one new album with each new lineup that they had, probably just so they could sell a new CD to people going to their shows who want to hear an album by this current lineup of the Temptations. So now you've got lead singer Bruce Williamson, you've got second baritone singer Terry Weeks, third baritone singer Otis Williams, the original, bass singer Joe Herndon, and tenor singer still since 1983, Ron Tyson. This is the lineup that I finally got a chance to see when I saw the Temptations live for the one and only time so far on October 3rd, 2014, locally here at the Hard Rock in Coquitlam. I was so excited to be there, and I got a chance to shake the hands of each of the Temptations members, except for Otis Williams, the actual original Temptation, which I'm still salty about, but that's fine. I should mention that in 2013, the Temptations had a pretty rough couple of weeks for Motown in general, as in February of 2013, former Temptations tenor singer Ricky Owens, who had been their tenor singer from 71 to 75, passed away from cancer, I believe. And then the very next week, Richard Street, who had been in the Temptations on and off from 69 to 93, also died within a week. And then a couple of weeks after that, one of the original Miracles passed away. It was just a horrible month for Motown fans. You'd think that would bring the Temptations' history to its current day, but it does not, because in 2016, the Temptations changed things up again. In early 2016, Joe Herndon, the bass singer of 13 years, and Bruce Williamson, the lead singer of 8 years, were both let go from the group, and they brought in new members, Larry Braggs, who becomes the lead singer, and Willie Green, who becomes the new bass singer. I haven't actually really checked out many videos of this new lineup of the Temptations, so I can't really comment on them, but they're the new guys. And then they released a new album last year, in 2018, called All the Times that the Temptations are still recording on and off to this day. Also in 2018, the curse continues, and Temptations' former lead singer, Dennis Edwards, passes away, leaving the Temptations as pretty much the only viable Temptations-related touring act. Dennis Edwards had, of course, had his Temptations review group for many years until he passed away. And that's where the Temptations are right now. As of right now, I'm recording this in July of 2019. I had to think about that. I had to think about what month it was. As of July 2019, their lineup remains Larry Bragg's lead singer, second baritone Terry Weeks, who has been in the Temptations for 22 years, tenor singer Ron Tyson, who's actually kind of a Temptations veteran now. He's been in the group since '83. You've got bass singer Willie Green, and of course, the original third baritone Otis Williams. So Otis Williams is 77, I believe. I want to say he's 77 years old now. Still touring the Temptations. Still do a lot of dates, actually. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Temptations still continue to have lineup changes. It's an inevitable. Let me just count here. I'm going to count the amount of people who have been official members of the Temptations over their 57-year history. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 15, 20, 24. There have been 24 Temptations since the dawn of their group. And of that 24, I just off camera did the math. 12 of them have since passed away. So only half of the people who have ever been Temptations are still around. I'm thrilled that they're still touring in any capacity at all, though. It's cool to see Otis Williams still carrying on that Temptations legacy to this day. Anyway, so I just thought I've always wanted to do a video on the long and complicated, complex history of the Temptations, and now I have, and now my brain hurts. Because, oh my god, is it a lot of stuff to consider. A lot of stuff has happened in the 57 years since they were founded. They still tour with the Four Tops a lot now, and the Four Tops are the opposite story of the Temptations, as the Four Tops, out of most groups, had pretty much the longest time spent with the original lineup. I think I'm going to do a video on them eventually. But that'll do it for this one. Thanks for watching. For those of you who don't know, I'm also a professional musician myself. I'm based out of British Columbia. I do touring dates around BC, and you can find a full list of my upcoming performance dates down there in the description, as well as links to where you can find my music, where it's sold or streamed online. Yeah, subscribe to this channel if you're enjoying these videos. I always appreciate new subscribers. It's always brightens up my day a little bit. And yeah, also ring the notification bell if you want to be notified every time I upload a new video, which will be tomorrow and every day for the foreseeable future. And like this video if you liked what you saw. Thanks so much for watching this complicated story of the Temptations history and the Temptations curse. Yeah, blows my mind. But yeah, thanks so much for watching. As usual, there'll be a new vlog again tomorrow. Catch you then. Thanks for watching.